She's dual trained and perfectly trained for us, because not only that, she's also one of the great experts in the country and in the world on childhood obesity. And if we're talking about a nutritional problem at home, this is an enormous problem that's confronting our country right now. And there's an opportunity to learn from what she's doing and what she's concerned with. So she's involved in all kinds of research programs around the U.S. and involved very heavily with regard to the American Academy of Pediatrics. So, but more importantly than that, we've been talking about world food issues, and in fact, it turns out that she's going to be discussing with us tonight work that demonstrates that this isn't just a problem of obesity, of too much to eat. It's a problem that involves micronutrients and involves a remarkable series of events that can happen within the exact same family. So we're talking about things that occur and make the entire development process different than we expected. So we have an opportunity to learn at the cutting edge of the newest ideas and one of the best summaries of this that we can possibly get anywhere, any place right now. So we're very fortunate to have her with us tonight, and she is a tremendous dynamo of a person to work with, and she goes. She is. I hope it's appropriate to say you're a nominee. Is that okay? She's a nominee for the presidency of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and is going to be giving a special kickoff for that this week on Thursday night. So she has to be exiting on Thursday afternoon, so I want you to be aware that we're fortunate that she's scheduled early in the program for us so that we can have time, she can have relaxed time with us, so to speak, to get to know who we are and help contribute to the efforts that we're all working with this week. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Professor Hassink, who's talking about, as you can see here, the global problem of the double burden of obesity and undernutrition. Thank you.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here, and this is an amazing convergence of your work and some of the very early thinking among the obesity folks about obesity as malnutrition, and the convergence of obesity and undernutrition in the work, in all of our work. Just by way of background, I started our obesity clinic at Memorial Day 26 years ago. At that point, obesity was not on the radar screen, anybody's radar screen, and I was actually seeing mostly adolescents. I was being laughed at, actually, because people didn't understand why I, a pediatrician, a medical doctor, would be interested in obesity. And it was seen at that time, and still a little bit in this time, as sort of a moral failing. If only kids and parents would just do the right thing, we wouldn't have obesity. And I'm not going to go into what we've learned about obesity in the 26 years in this talk, but only to say, for example, we now have young adults coming to liver transplant solely based on the liver disease that you get from obesity. We have 2-year-olds that you can see evidence of this liver disease starting. We have 8-year-olds who have type 2 diabetes. We have 5-year-olds with high cholesterol. So what we've seen across this epidemic level of obesity is the migration of adult diseases down into earliest childhood, and now I see babies who are obese. So it's an epidemic, and we can talk a lot about the seriousness and the burden that it's placing on our now 2 generations of children and the economic system and our healthcare system. But today I want to talk about something that I think is very important, because I think we will now be seeing the convergence of things that we might have thought were separate. So underweight and obesity are actually among the top 10 leading risk factors for the global burden of disease. And that's rather astounding, because in the past, infectious disease accounted for most of that burden. But when you think now we have nutritional diseases, nutritional conditions that are really heading the list for the disease risk, not just in our country, in the developed world, but globally. And so you know that obesity is excess calories and a positive energy balance at its basis. And it's a major risk factor for non-communicable diseases, diabetes and cardiovascular disease being the two that account for 2/3 of global mortality. This is a really unique situation that we haven't encountered before. And when you think about seeing children with obesity, we've never seen 100-pound 4-year-olds before. You know, we've never seen 250-pound 8-year-olds before. We've rarely seen 450-pound 15-year-olds, and those are the extremes. So not only do we have a burden across the entire population of overweight, we're seeing extremes of obesity we've never seen. Now, you're all familiar with undernutrition, and we're going to be talking today about stunting, which is decreased height for age, and wasting, which is significantly decreased weight for height, and some about the deficiencies of essential vitamins and minerals. And we know that when you're undernourished, you're increasingly susceptible to infectious disease. Infectious disease also takes a toll nutritionally, but you're also susceptible for cognitive impairment if you're a child. And you'll see that when we talk about this, that you're susceptible for later risk of obesity and non-communicable diseases. So we've seen, we've been thinking about obesity and undernutrition as separate and even sometimes opposing entities. So at least in this country, the hunger community and the obesity community have not converged and are working on a population which often has both of these conditions embedded in it. These obesity and undernutrition coexist globally, as you're well aware, nationally, locally, within families, and even within individuals. So we have this convergence that we'll be talking about. So the double burden that we're talking about today of under and overnutrition occurring simultaneously within a population is really an entity that we need to be thinking about. I wanted to just point you to this slide, which is an overview of nutrition transition and its health implications. And you can see that there's demographic transitions from societies with high fertility and high mortality. As the mortality is reduced, fertility is reduced, increased older population. Epidemiologic transitions go from a high prevalence of infectious disease. As you control the sanitation and the infection control, you begin to, and focus on famine alleviation, you begin to see the emergence of chronic diseases, and you go from a high prevalence of undernutrition, the famine recedes, you then go quickly, the developing countries are going much more quickly into obesity from undernutrition, at faster rates than the developed countries, and you see the emergence of chronic non-communicable diseases. And there on the bottom gives us a hint how we might be coping with this. How are we going to focus on this dual burden? How are we going to focus on both our interventions to prevent it and the policy and initiatives that we need to address it? So an example of an epidemiologic transition in developing countries would be urbanization. So increasing the physical activity decreases, all the labor-saving devices work, the cars, the phone lines, the TV, the appliances, improved health and nutrition in women and children, reduction of diarrheal diseases, sanitary food control, increased income and food supplementation programs. So in Chile, when they underwent their transition from high malnutrition to obesity, they were giving poor families about 200 to 600 calories more per person than they actually needed, and that actually accelerated the transition as they did all these other things. So you can see that some of the interventions for undernutrition in the right settings actually, if not carefully done, are propelling the transition into obesity. So this is the prevalence of obesity globally, and you can see the dark red is over 30%. So we are certainly in this country affected by that. But look at some of the other countries that are affected by very high rates of obesity in North Africa and South Africa. And then 20 to 29% are the golden colors. Much of Russia and Australia and some of South America, and then 10 to 20% in the tan, and then less than 10% in the pale color. So clearly this is a global epidemic, and in fact the World Health Organization declared obesity as a global health epidemic. But then you see malnutrition. And so while not overlapped, we clearly see we have a coexistence, at least globally, of obesity and malnutrition, and the darkest rather, the 35% of a population that's undernourished, and you can see that's in sub-Saharan Africa, 20 to 34%, most of Africa, 5 to 20%, you can see that's Asia. So you can see the hotspots still that exist, and even though strides have been made in malnutrition, there's still an incredible burden of disease. So I made this slide just to begin our thinking about what is the nutritional landscape that we're seeing. We're seeing, of course, both obesity and undernutrition and stunting. We're seeing a misaligned food supply with inadequate dietary nutritional access and poor quality. And we're seeing hunger and food insecurity. So I see children with obesity. Hunger is an incredibly frequent complaint in that population, especially in the under 5s. And we'll talk a little bit about why. And we see at the micronutrient deficiencies coexist in both populations of under and overnutrition. And then I think at the bottom, the lack of healthy lifestyle skills. And you heard Saul talking this morning about cooking. I will tell you that very few people that I see cook. When you're trying to advocate for a healthy diet, it is incredibly difficult to do that when nobody knows how to prepare a meal. We've taught cooking classes. One of my mothers said, was very proud. She said, I cooked tonight, and I said, this is great, what did you cook? She said, I bought a bag of lettuce, and I bought the chicken strips, and I put the chicken strips on the lettuce. That's an advance. Okay, that's meal assembly, right? It gets you one step closer to cooking. We taught pre-diabetic adolescents to cook. There are no measuring cups in many of these households. There are no tablespoons. There's no knowledge of how to put together a meal, and even what constitutes a healthy meal. So the lack of essential skills, and I was so touched by what Saul said, because these cultural skills that have been handed down, skills for meal preparation, even parenting skills around food and making routines for your day and little children, somehow the bottom has dropped out of the transmission of these skills in our culture, at least. I wanted to focus, I'm a pediatrician, so I'm very focused on the maternal child dyad, and I wanted to start focusing about maternal undernutrition. And this is an enormous problem, the enormity of which I think we're just beginning to recognize in terms of its repercussions. But you can see there that Bangladesh has higher maternal undernutrition than any other developing country. And over a third of their women of childbearing age have chronic energy deficiency. And as the mother goes, so goes the child. You can't have a well-nourished child, an infant that is not, doesn't have intrauterine growth retardation if you have a malnourished mother. In Pakistan, the prevalence of malnutrition in lactating and pregnant women is higher than their non-pregnant counterparts, which is quite interesting. And Indonesia, a high percentage of women who are malnourished, and almost half of pregnant women are anemic. So we have an incredible burden on women of childbearing age, pregnant women, and women who are lactating. In South Asia, maternal malnutrition is responsible for up to half of intrauterine growth restriction. And babies who are born with intrauterine growth restriction actually have, if they're born into a setting where nutrition later becomes available, they have high rates of obesity and later chronic disease, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And this work was really kicked off by David Barker, and you may be familiar with his work, when he looked at middle-aged adults in England and found that the higher propensity of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and central adiposity was in the adults that were small at birth. So being small at birth, and it took him probably a decade to get this work published, because nobody would believe that something happened at birth could affect your health in midlife. And that started the whole field of thinking about intrauterine programming. And now that we know about epigenetics, we'll talk about that in a while, how you can be programmed intrauterine to actually change gene expression and then fall into a nutritional environment that actually was not restricted and develop these diseases in middle age. And then you see sub-Saharan Africa, only 3 out of 10 countries have shown a decline in maternal malnutrition. And so the burden of all that malnutrition you see is falling on the mother. Why? And so this brings up the point we talked about today about the women and what's happening to the women. And so in developing countries, women usually fall behind the men in their access to food, healthcare, and education. And I think we've all seen this. And so there's illiteracy, poverty, and lack of employment. And then the finer factors, education, exposure to media, and domestic decision-making that is skewed away from the women. And women with low status in societies have weaker control over household resources, tighter time constraints because of physical labor, less access to information and health services, often poor mental health and lower self-esteem. So these factors are not conducive to climbing your way out of the situation if you're undernourished and you're trying to access resources and you're trying to gather food for your family and you're trying to cook that food in this situation. Additional stressors on mothers and women with our food insecurity. We'll talk about that. Inadequate diets, recurrent infections, poor health care, heavy work burdens, and gender inequalities. So the very dyad that we societies have traditionally needed to protect for the future, the mother-infant dyad, is under incredible stress. So we have intertwined undernutrition and obesity. So a mother who's undernourished in pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, and will have a child that's small, undernourished with some micronutrient deficits, programmed possibly for later obesity, and at greater risk for developing non-communicable disease. So in this country, we worry about the moms who have obesity and diabetes, and their intrauterine environment predisposes the child to have higher rates of obesity and diabetes. And so we're very worried about this generational progression. But we need to also be worried about the mothers in the developing world who, the other end of the U-shaped curve, the small babies, are also at risk for later obesity and non-communicable diseases. So more than a third of all under 5 child deaths are due to malnutrition, and we're going to focus on the under 5 population today, and this represents 11% of the global disease burden. So we're losing our youngest children. The global prevalence of underweight has declined. The average rate of reduction is about 2%. This is not going to be fast enough to meet the World Health Organization goals. It's declining, but not fast enough. And you see here underweight, again, this is under 5-year-olds. So the purple is over a third of the under 5-year-olds underweight. Again, you see sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Africa, again, goes from 10 to 30%, and less than 10% in the more developed worlds. But these are our under 5-year-olds, and they're the most susceptible to the diarrheal diseases and infectious diseases. So you can see the progression. The higher income and upper middle income countries on the very bottom of this graph have low rates of underweight, and the low income and lower middle income have reduced their rates, but we don't have parity, and there's some stalling out of that rate reduction at present. Wasting is low weight for height, significantly low weight for height. This has decreased. But 70% of the world's children with wasting live in Asia, and most in South Central Asia, where 25 million children are affected. So even though the numbers are going down, this represents an incredible number of the population affected. And you can see wasting, this is severe malnutrition, and you can see the concentrations there in the dark red, over 15%. Now, stunting has also decreased, and this is low height for weight. The number of stunting under 5 in the world has declined from 253 million to 165 million, still an incredible burden. And stunting is very interesting. Stunting is kind of a cumulative record of the past and present growth restrictions affecting the child's length. So stunting occurs in a situation of inadequate nutrition compounded with frequent infections, in settings, socio-ecological settings of household food insecurity, inadequate health care, poor sanitation, and lack of access to health services. So stunting is sort of a sociologic record that the child bears in their body. And you can see that there's political contextual factors here: poverty, unemployment, limited access to capital, and it's the most prevalent form of undernutrition worldwide. And we see stunting in this country, and we see it from our children that come up from Mexico and South America, who are short for their, they have low height for age, and they sort of bear that record of generationally and what they've been through in this country. And there's some work that shows in some of our lowest socioeconomic populations in this country, there's still some stunting. And it's not well worked out in this country because we're not looking for it as aggressively as we look for it in the developing world. But the prevalence among children less than 5 of stunting was 38% in Africa, that's 60 million children. It's a lower percentage in Asia, but more children, 100 million children, and in Latin America, 13%. And this takes place very early in childhood. This takes place soon after birth, and it reaches its lowest value at 2 years of age. So stunting takes place very early, and once you're stunted, you don't recover that height. So the intrauterine period and the first 2 years of postnatal life are crucial for preventing the stunting and malnutrition that sets you up for later obesity and chronic non-communicable diseases in the environment that developing countries are transitioning into food-wise. Consequences of stunting alone: 15% of deaths in children are related to stunting, and nutrition infection interactions are the risk here for these young children. Maybe as much to the point as death is the morbidity. So stunting is associated with impaired cognitive development. And this is coupled, you have a child who has risk for impaired cognitive development and in a deprived environment. So what you get is lower school performance, poor attention in class, greater grade repetition, higher dropout of school, lower graduation rate. So the very population you're trying to advance is emerging, starting with a burden that impedes that advancement. And maternal stunting and intrauterine growth retardation or restriction are a risk for obesity. And this is stunting. Again, over 40% is in the dark blue of children who are stunted, same kind of regions, a little bit in Central America and South America. And again, you see that the upper and high income countries have reduced the rates, and the upper middle income rates have gone down, but the low, least developed countries are having trouble wrestling their rates to the ground. So the reduction, the goals that we have for reducing underweight and reducing stunting are stagnating. And we can think about why that may be, but we're not getting there as fast as we wanted to. So what's happening in the population shift, if we step back and say, what's happening when we're trying to shift from a high prevalence of infectious disease, malnutrition, periodic famine, and poor sanitation, we're trying to shift that curve, and we're shifting right into chronic and degenerative disease and obesity. So if we look at type 2 diabetes, which is the epidemic behind the obesity epidemic, so we have the obesity epidemic and then we have the chronic disease epidemic following it. The lowest rates of diabetes are in populations with traditional lifestyles. We have a 7% prevalence or slightly higher in adults here. But the urbanized Fiji Islanders who went from their traditional lifestyle right into an urbanized lifestyle have a 23% rate of diabetes, and you heard about the Pima Indians who had the same kind of rapid transition. The largest increases in type 2 are in populations which have gone the most rapid change, developing to sort of a westernized diet. And think about type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is kind of a nasty disease. You start out on oral medication, it's not that cheap. You can move quickly to insulin, you need injections, you need insulin pumps, you need eye care, you need wound care, you need foot care. It's a highly costly disease in the countries that are least prepared to deal with the cost of this disease. And so we look at this kind of transition, and this is under 5-year-olds overweight. Okay, so we just looked at under 5-year-olds, their undernutrition, now we look at their overweight. And we're seeing slightly different pattern of overweight. Some of the North African countries and some of the Caucasus, we are still having the epidemic fueled in these very young children. So we have both underweight children at risk for later obesity and overweight children already at risk for later communicable diseases. So we run a bariatric surgery program at the hospital where I work, and every adolescent, and it's not many adolescents, it's a tool, not a cure, but every adolescent that's come to surgery has been obese by the age of 5. So once you're obese by the age of 5, it's hard to recover, and the longer into childhood you go with obesity, the harder it is to recover that. And so we see the escalating rates, again, most in the developing world, but also in the, most in the developed world, but also in the developing world. So David Ludwig would say that the obesity trajectory has 4 phases. The first phase is a steady increase in childhood obesity, and I think we're seeing that. There's some indication we may be leveling off, but right now 30% of children in this country have overweight or obesity, 60% of adults have overweight or obesity. Phase 2 would be the emergence of serious obesity-related comorbidities, and we're certainly seeing that in childhood and in adulthood. Phase 3 is medical complications leading to life-threatening disease and death in middle age. So if you have diabetes, type 2 diabetes at 8, which we have seen, there's a 20-year trajectory till you have end-organ failure if you're not taking care of that disease. So now we have young adults, or middle-aged adults having the end-organ failure of diabetes, renal disease, ocular disease, cardiovascular disease. And then Phase 4, acceleration of the obesity epidemic by transgenerational transmission, which means these small babies and these large babies who have altered intrauterine environments are emerging at greater risk for obesity. So this is just a cartoon of kind of a funny cartoon of epigenetics, where we've known from animal studies that if you modulate intake and methyl group dietary intake in animals, you can influence methylation on the DNA and histone acetylation. And when the DNA gets methylated or acetylated, that gene readout is changed. And it can be changed for your entire life and the life of your children. So the environment, as we eat our environment, as we ingest the environment, and these changes occur, they are not so far found to be so easily reversible. They stay with us, they program us for later disease, and our children are at future risk. So we have a much more highly dynamic interaction with us and the genome and our environment than we ever really realized. And so there's a classic twin study where they studied twins from 3 years old to 78, and they found that the methylation patterns in the 3-year-olds were pretty similar, almost identical. These were identical twins. The 78-year-olds who had their own lives and done their own thing had methylation patterns that were as different from each other as 2 unrelated individuals. So methylation is the read of your trajectory through the environment. So this is the theory called the developmental origins of health and disease, what affects us early in terms of our intrauterine and early infancy programs us for the rest of our life. So fetal and infant nutrition, infection, and other epigenetic factors. There's some fascinating animal studies that show that rat mothers who don't pay attention to, who neglect the rat pups have different methylation patterns. Different methylation patterns on their DNA than pups who were not neglected. So we are thinking that the whole work on adverse childhood events and toxic stress and later disease is mediated through some of these epigenetic mechanisms. So we have short-term effects on brain and growth and metabolic programming, and long-term effects on chronic disease, education, and stunting and lower income. So these early effects are very important, and this is why this maternal infant dyad and these under 5 children are so critical to think about. So I wanted to just show some United States data, and so we know that we have obesity prevalence, and these are 2 to 4-year-olds, and it's very interesting. It's local. So although you see the big maps with the southeastern states with high rates of obesity, when you boil this down to county-level data, you see coexisting high obesity rates next to normal weight counties and higher prevalence of obesity sitting next to normal weight and sometimes underweight. So it can be a very local phenomenon. This is a map just highlighting and reminding us to think about food insecurity. So the darkest states where we do have higher prevalence of obesity also have high prevalence of food insecurity. And the food insecurity questions you ask are, have you ever worried about running out of food in the last month? and have you been afraid that you would not be able to feed your family? And they map pretty well to people being afraid that by the end of the month, or at some time in that last period, they will not be able to feed their families. And if ever you have looked into food pantries, what do you see in food pantries? You don't usually see a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. You see a lot of processed foods, canned foods, because that's what's stable. So when you can't feed your family and you go to other food sources, you're not eating the most healthy food that you could. There are nutritional risks in the overweight population, and we used to think when I started, oh, they're overweight, they're well-nourished. They're not well-nourished. They're poorly nourished often. And this is the prevalence of iron deficiency within the, this is an old slide, so at risk for overweight would be overweight, and overweight in the dark would be obese kids. So obese kids actually are having a higher prevalence of iron deficiency, and when you look at the World Bank and you see how they look at nutritional markers of developing and mid-developed and developed countries, iron deficiency is one of those markers, and we're sliding a little backwards in our country on that nutritional marker. So if we think what's happened, and we've talked a lot about what's happened, it's not that obesity's never been in the world. Obesity has been in the world, but in very small amounts. So obesity it correlates to our ability to survive famine. So the people that could most efficiently manage their energy and make the most of their calories and survive the cycles of famine. And obesity in many cultures was a sign of wealth, so that it was promoted as a sign of plenty. You had enough food. What we have now, though, is an epidemic of obesity, and we have the skewing of the population and the disease burden. But where we came from may have been hunter-gatherers, where we had diets high in carbs and fiber, and low in fat, and high in physical activity. So, and then you see that as cycles of famine develop, diet becomes much less varied. And then there are large variations in availability, and so there's acute food scarcity, and then there's availability, and but availability to only a few, and physical activity may remain high because of the labor demands, and this is where stunting can occur. And then you see these stages: receding famine, degenerative disease, and behavioral change. And so receding famine is where the diet begins to emerge again. We have enough food. We then move into too much, maybe the wrong kind of food, and we go into the obesity and degenerative disease. And so Barry Popkin would say maybe there's a stage 5, and maybe that's behavioral change, where we are now, as we are here, consciously trying to eat a healthy diet and replace sedentarianism with physical activity and reduce and improve health. Now, I'm not sure that behavior alone is going to get us where we need to go. At least, I think individually initiated behavior will get us somewhere, but I'm not sure that that's going to be enough to tackle what we need to tackle, and that we need to tackle on a policy level arena. So these are some real cases, because this is not a problem of these 5 categories being totally separate. There's a lot of mixed cases. So in India and the Philippines, you have a high prevalence of undernutrition in adults and children, with high rates of micronutrient deficiencies, coupled with the emergence of overnutrition, especially in urban adults. So in India, almost a quarter of the women of childbearing age already have a high body mass index. In Delhi, more than 40% of them. And obesity rates in the highest socioeconomic classes are half of the women and about a third of the men. So here they have a mixed case where you have still the undernutrition in adults and children, but a group of adults becoming more obese. In South Africa, there's significant stunting. Underweight's declining, but they have continued infectious disease, TB and HIV, and a high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies, and then emergence again of the overweight and obesity in adulthood. And it's interesting, I don't know if you picked it up on one of those global graphs. There was no data for South Africa on some of the stunting and wasting, so I think we don't really know exactly what's happening there. China, Egypt, and Mexico have both stunting and overweight in children, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is where you have both conditions occurring in the same child. High rates of obesity in adults with the chronic diseases, and micronutrient deficiencies prevalent across the board, particularly iron and vitamin A deficiency. In anemia, in women of childbearing age and in children is very high, as it is in India. And so iron deficiency impairs cognitive development in a child. So you have a mother who's iron deficient, the baby's born with lack of iron stores, she's trying to lactate, no iron, the baby weans, not enough iron, and there's a direct link to cognitive impairment there. Mexico again, and Philippines, high rates of anemia in pregnant women and young children. In the Philippines, there's been more studies about why this might occur, poor child feeding and weaning practices, and poor compliance with iron supplementation. So there's a lot of implementation science in this. You can know what to do, but knowing how to get families to take up the intervention is another problem, as it is across the whole range of nutritional problems, including obesity. So what's happening now is that we're seeing the effects of these lifestyle transitions not only within countries, but within mother-child pairs. So there are examples of households with an underweight member and an overweight or obese member. And these are the numbers, China, Brazil, and Russia. And these pairs are often an underweight child and an overweight non-elderly adult, an overweight parent. And you can see how high these numbers are. And so this is fascinating to me. How can you have this scenario where in the same house I have an underweight child and an obese adult, and what would I do about it? In rural Indonesia, you also see this double burden. It's called the maternal-child double burden. And in rural Bangladesh, the same thing. Why? What predicts this maternal-child double burden? Well, maternal short stature and older age. Higher maternal education was protective of this double burden, obese mom, underweight, undernourished child. Children who were older and later in the birth order and female will be more likely to be part of this mother-child care. And I don't know, I think these are just associations, so we don't know causality necessarily. Breastfeeding can be protective if the breast milk is good. If the breast milk is inadequate because if the mom was undernourished, it wouldn't be. And family characteristics, larger size, higher per capita household, were associated with maternal-child burden. So it's intuitive and counterintuitive. More income, the adults are getting heavier. What's happening to the children in these households? So what about maternal short stature? Maternal short stature really affects malnutrition. That's the previous generation, and early in the mother's life. Stunting alone in a mother, in addition to not including malnutrition or obesity, increases the risk of having a stunted child, and stunting has an increased rate of obesity and chronic disease. So you see how complex this gets, and it's how the history of one generation and one generation's nutrition carries on into the next generation. Why do we have stunting and obesity in the same child? Children who are stunted may have impaired fat oxidation capacity, which is a risk factor for obesity. The leptin receptors in the brain may be altered by stunting and increase the likelihood of obesity. And you have that whole intrauterine programming. So we don't know why children we have this mixed pattern of under and over nutrition in the same child. So what's an adequate diet for children? I think this is a great definition, appropriate density of nutrients, sufficiently diverse, that it supplies adequate but not excessive amounts of nutrition, is palatable and culturally acceptable, affordable and available year-round, and supports normal growth and development. I mean, that obviously is the goal. So the nutritional status of the infant does depend on the status of their mother. So poor maternal micronutrient nutrition during pregnancy contributes to iron deficiency. And mothers, on the same token, mothers with obesity are likely to give birth to premature and low birth weight babies at risk for depleted iron stores. So we have micronutrient deficiencies occurring on both ends of the spectrum. Breast milk is such a wonderful thing, and we tend to be cavalier, in this country at least, thinking that all breast milk is good, and it is, except if you're a malnourished mom and you lack micronutrients. And there's also some emerging evidence that breast milk of a diabetic mom has different factors in it than normal weight mom, and maybe predisposes the children a little more to diabetes. Certainly leptin is in breast milk, adiponectin is in breast milk, and these growth factors are in breast milk. So all breast milk is not equal, and I think in this country we tend to think it is, but it's not. Weaning and transition are critical times when a child comes off breast milk or formula and goes into the normal adult diet. Low-income countries, a third of the families were able to prepare proper food, but when they served it to the infants, they served it in less amounts, and they were giving them fewer calories. So it's the opposite problem of obesity, where they're preparing food in large amounts and giving large amounts. These parents were giving lower than recommended amounts. And so not only giving them the food and giving them preparation skills, but they have to know how much to give the child. I think this is probably my most interesting slide to me. Dietary diversity, not only total calories, are important to foster appropriate growth and prevent stunting. So if you supplement kids with just calories, just carbohydrate or fat calories that are undernourished, you don't prevent stunting. So the quality of nutrition is incredibly important, and energy supplements alone do not prevent stunting. This is sort of one of those cycles which are touch points about all the burden of child undernutrition, starting with a low birth weight baby, to a stunted child and adolescent, to a woman who's malnourished, and the cycle keeps repeating. And there's the same kind of cycle with obesity, where you have an obese mom giving, or a diabetic mom giving rise to a baby who is predisposed to obesity and diabetes, and or if they're normal weight, and if she delivers prematurely, which is high risk of, they're low birth weight and they fall into this cycle. So what we might think about doing? Clearly, preconceptual nutrition through the first at least 2 years of life is highly critical here. We need to work hard to improve the weight and micronutrient status of mothers. Now, this is easy to say and hard to do, because if I think of my adolescent girls in clinic who are obese and I'm trying to improve their status, at the very age you're trying to improve somebody's nutrition status is the hardest age to get an adolescent to pay attention to what they're eating, to take charge of their diet, to have those executive functions that don't hit until their 20s and mid-20s. Just a point about obesity, there is some literature that would suggest that obesity itself has a cognitive impact. So there's some literature in adults and children that would suggest that the frontal lobe executive functioning is compromised in obesity, and we don't know if it's chicken or the egg or what happens. But we do know that leptin receptors are in the brain. Leptin itself causes dendrite growth. So we know that we are beginning to think there's also a cognitive impairment around obesity. Surely promote breastfeeding. We pay exquisite attention to the content of early diets, and address physical activity on either end of the spectrum in mothers and children. So if mothers are overburdened with a high physical activity when they're pregnant and they're lactating and they're trying to care for young children, or they may be sedentary on the other end when they're, and the children will therefore be sedentary when they're obese. Strategies to improve micronutrient intake. Education is necessary but rarely sufficient, because the implementation here is how you modify your diet, how you incorporate these foods into the culture and the food preparation, where you get the food. And we may need now a bundle. People are thinking of bundling interventions, which include micronutrients, complementary foods, treatment for worms and diarrheal diseases, and behavior change programs in a bundled intervention to tackle this problem at birth and before birth. I think we need to really build a consensus around approaches of how we're going to deal with malnutrition on both ends of the spectrum. I think we need to be thinking about how the obesity communities and the undernutrition communities are going to converge. You see this in politics. There's often the hunger in our country. They're often the folks, the hunger people who are interested in malnutrition and hunger are often on the other side of the fence from the obesity people, because our interventions are not integrated. This is a basic nutrition problem with people working at both ends of it, not integrating the effort. So I think there's a call here to begin to integrate our efforts and see it as the nutritional problem that it is on both sides of the spectrum. And I'll just leave you with this, because this is one of those wonderful complicated slides, but it sort of shows you that the importance of optimal fetal nutrition and development, what are the markers for that, and then how we might do an integration step about ensuring adequate and healthy nutrition for our mothers and children. So I'm going to leave you with that and be glad to take questions. Thank you.
You mentioned early on.
So can we speak up very loud?
Yeah, you mentioned that people don't cook.
Yeah.
When and why did we forget how to prepare meals?
So what happened to home ec is one thing in this country. So when I was in school, I took home economics. There is no home economics. Home economics was moved to vocational technical schools. It's now out of high schools that want to prepare kids for college. So that's just one tiny little basic thing. The promotion of processed and convenience foods. So, you know, if you can put it in the microwave and have a dinner, the incredible stress that families are under, where meal preparation time, if you say to a mother, you know, can you prepare that, and it's 20 extra minutes, that's 20 extra minutes. If it's not already dialed into her thinking, she doesn't have. We have parents coming home with hungry children. I mean, these are not enormous problems, but these are all the tiny little problems that conspire to having people that don't cook. So knowledge has gone by the wayside. Time, stress, and child demand. So we didn't even talk about marketing to children and what foods are marketed to children and parents. So children demand often these foods. And so I remember a mom, I was in clinic and she had a 13 and 14-year-old and they have obesity and we're talking about it. And I said, so I asked a simple question, who decides on dinner? And she goes, well, they do. So what do you mean they do? She said, how do you do that? And she said, well, one night the 13-year-old decides and one night the 14-year-old decides. So there's a stepping back of parents from their role. So often when I talk to parents, I say, your role as a parent is to provide healthy nutrition for your family. That's okay. That's like safety. You can do that because often they have stepped back from that role and they're letting, I had a mom who was very proudly told me her 2-year-old was operating the microwave. Now, you know, you can see what that mom's thinking. She thinks, I have a bright 2-year-old. She can operate the microwave. You know, I have a 5-year-old, actually I had a 12-year-old last week that was home alone with her 14-year-old brother, mom working nights. So mom's working 3 to 10 at night. They're home, and mom's trying very hard to ensure good nutrition, but she leaves the house, they're home alone, and the girl starts cooking. Macaroni and cheese, or eating cereal, you know. So there are a lot of intervening factors, but I think not just the basic knowledge when you get these families together, just the basic knowledge of, do you know how to measure? Do you know how to portion? Do you know how to do something that isn't frying? They don't have it. So we're at a huge skill deficit right now. Sorry, I go on and on.
Are we seeing a significant problem in the mother-child love burden in the U.S.?
Not. That's such a good question, and I actually wrote to Gary Foster, who's a researcher at Temple, to ask Gary, did he have any data on this, because people haven't really been looking that carefully. There's one Head Start article that shows some short stature, and we've known for a long time in poverty-stricken populations there's short stature, which we've called short stature, but probably is stunting. But I don't think we've looked carefully enough yet, because this has been seen as the problem of the other. But I think we probably do have it. I see it in clinic, and this is so interesting. For years I've been seeing the immigrant children come up from Mexico with shorter than expected heights. So if you have been overnourished, say, with calories, and you have open epiphysis, which means your bones can still grow, you're going to attain a height, you should be attaining a height at least the 95th percentile. Even you can push height beyond the genetic potential by overfeeding somebody if they can still grow for a while until they go through puberty. And I've been seeing these immigrant children from Mexico come with heights under the 50th percentile. The endocrinologist says, well, no, Sandy, they don't meet the definition for short stature, but they're stunted. You know, so we haven't. I think we haven't. I think we would find if we looked. I don't think we have thought about it that way.
Comment on the phenomenon in increase like here.
You can use the microphone, please.
While you're at it.
If anyone has questions, you can queue up and
Sorry, this phenomenon in countries like India, in populations that are chronically or historically undernourished, getting enough food to get to what we consider normal weight, but at normal weight exhibiting metabolic syndrome and diabetes.
Yes. So you bring up such a good question. And you know, now that you brought it up, we've known for a long time that Southeast Asian, at least South Asian populations have metabolic disease at much lower body mass indexes, obesity, than other populations. And they carry more of their fat even at normal weights centrally. And what you're making me think of is, are they carrying that, is that historical for them? Is there something that has happened to that population because they've had severe undernutrition and now they're in some kind of transition and you can't hit that normal point? Something's happening, you know, you just feed them enough and yet they're getting maldistribution of fat and metabolic disease. And I think that's such an excellent point. We don't know why, but if you are predisposed to obesity by genetics or heredity or whatever, and you merely shift your diet 150 calories a day, what you can't do is automatically just burn those calories. That's part of the predisposition. That's 15 pounds a year. So what you're saying is it's hard to thread that needle, right? As you're transitioning populations, what is the metabolically healthy diet to have? And it does probably depend on what population you're talking about. And I think the pediatricians I talk to from India are wrestling with this because now they have to screen at much lower weights for metabolic disease, and they're getting type 2 diabetes at BMIs in the low 30s, where we're getting them in the mid to high 30s. So yeah, I don't think we know why, but it's clearly there. Yeah.
So what kind of impact is the food aid having in the global south? What's the predominant type of food that is being distributed through all the NGOs?
Yeah.
And is there any data on the impacts?
Well, the thing that I know about, I don't know, is the refugee population. So there have been some refugee populations in, I think, forget the name of them, they're in sub-Saharan Africa. They've been refugees for a very long time and they're dependent totally on food aid. And the food aid is coming in high carb, high fat, low produce, low fiber food aid, and they have epidemic obesity. They were nomadic, they left their country, they're now in refugee camps, and they're undergoing this transition very rapidly. So I think that's something that probably should be focused on. Are we giving the right kind of aid? You know, are we promoting the very things that we didn't want to promote by trying to think about it in calories alone? I mean, what are the most easily transportable calories? You know, canned food, high energy dense, sort of fat, protein food, right, cereals. So we may, I don't know that that's been dialed in. What is the match for that population? What food for that population would be the best?
What do you suspect?
I suspect that we're doing exactly what we just said. We're giving them the easily transportable, high energy dense foods, which are cheap and give you calories, but not good nutrition.
Thank you. Is there any movement between pediatricians and obstetricians to educate young mothers who are about ready to produce so that they, from day one, start good nutrition with their children? Let me tell you one small thing. I ride public transportation down to my studio, and on that I see routinely mothers who give their 2-year-old children the little open bag of Fritos, and there is it's very obvious that the child is from the first learn how to do this properly. putting 2 little fingers in and eating the Frito very, very properly. And this is across the board, that the children are eating Fritos or candy bars on their way to whatever it is they're going to preschool or nursery school or daycare or something.
So there are so many aspects to that. One is cost. So a mother said to me, Dr. Hassink, a $1 value meal, that's not an option for me anymore. That's $1 where I can feed my family. Now, is it good calories? No, but it's filling. The kid's not going to say they're hungry. So cost is a huge driver. You know, the cost of that bag of Fritos, it doesn't spoil. You can leave it on the shelf for like 10 years, you know, nothing will happen to it. It's relatively cheap compared to produce. It doesn't have to be cooked and prepared. It's portable. So we have a food supply cost issue. Again, we have that mother may not know how to prepare healthy food. She may live in an area where there's not easy access to healthy food. Education is necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient because I had because this kind of thing, it's predominant in lower socioeconomic strata, but it's predominant, I see it across all economic strata. So people who knowing and doing, the drivers to feeding the children this kind of food are very high, and we're not helping with school food and daycare food, I will tell you. I mean, we're trying very hard to get healthy daycare food and healthy school food. But again, it's a cost issue. Government surplus cost, you know, so I completely agree with you. And getting into this population, the obstetricians are trying, they have new guidelines where they actually have guidelines about the amount of weight you can gain in pregnancy, because there was a movement for a while that it didn't really matter how much weight you gain. It turns out it matters a great deal. If you gain a lot of weight, you're an obese mom, your environment has changed, and you perpetuate this. How they're implementing that is not very clear. We have guidelines, but we don't have the right implementation.
So how frustrating is it to you and your peers dealing with problems where most of the variables have to do in the private sector and lifestyles and things that are outside of the pharmacological responses that you can actually address?
So, you know, people have been asking me that for 26 years. You know, how can you keep doing this? The answer for my personal answer is these are children, and I'm not going to let any child be unattended to. The frustration is you cannot beat this with individual willpower. So we are trying to talk to food companies and the producers of food and food policy. This is like the tobacco wars, only I think a little bit worse. They will follow the markets, and if there's, as long as there's demand. And I just read Campbell's Soup had tried a healthier line of soup. It wasn't selling. They're going back. You know, McDonald's has tried, when McDonald's put in their salads, the line, the economic return on investment of that was very high, but the hamburgers and french fries beat that because you got them in the store. So this is, it just adds fuel to the advocacy fire. I mean, at some point we're going to have to think about the impact. And the consumer, I'll just add this before I go on. In every other childhood disease, you have a consumer group. You have the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, you have the Arthritis Foundation, you have the cancer folks. There's no advocacy group for obesity, no parent advocacy group. I'm not sure why. But without that kind of population level advocacy, it's very hard because companies are like legislators. They respond to mass numbers. You know, if a whole bunch of people start doing something, they start taking notice. So, but the lack of our ability to get population level advocacy on this is a real impediment.
Well, unfortunately, you're saying that brings up something that is different than what I wanted to ask you, but it's like, I heard the talk on liquids and all the people that are drinking water, and I think that's a good example of bottled water, of like pet rocks, good advertising. And food companies are going to advertise what they can make the most money on. So, but my question has to do with the future. Now we're changing our insurance, medical insurance. Do you see that as being able to help change this, or I mean, are you optimistic?
There's two things that make me hopeful. One is that all preventive care for children, based on the Bright Futures guidelines, was rolled into the Affordable Care Act with no copay on the parents' part. So we can now deliver preventive care, and we have tried very hard to roll in nutrition and physical activity counseling into that. And the other is, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out, the focus on population health. So for the first time in a while, there will probably be rewards for managing a whole population